Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Welcome to the show. Yes, it's Tuesday night instead of Sunday night. And thanks for tuning in, everybody who's remembered. And for those who don't, yes, you can catch us on all the usual platforms a bit later on. I've just been down to Pembrokeshire doing a talk there, The Bigger Picture. Very interesting, actually. Met some interesting people right on the tip of West Wales, southwest Wales, obviously. And it was rather windy there and very little reception. So I'm back in Windows Towers at a secret location. Yes, we do get about. I wanted to tell you about some shows that are coming up, actually. We've got September the 8th, which is in East Sussex, and that's the Mad Hatters Festival. On the 15th, we have another place which is called Singleton Village Hall. That's it, it's written here. Chichester, Sussex, PO18 0HR. On the 21st, we're in Saffron Walden in Essex, the village hall there. October the 5th, we're doing Cheltenham. More details to be announced there. And yes, quite a busy September there. So tonight we're going to follow up the last two shows we've been doing. And this one's called Global Totalitarianism Explained. Now, those who still think a change in government can in any way bring more liberty, or as it used to be called, freedom, may find this quote here quite helpful. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. That was by H.L. Mencken. And it's actually a brilliant quote and sums things up perfectly. What are we in? We're in the war on terror. We're in the war on terraforming as well, because we talk about this a lot. The war on the literal terror, the earth, is through the United Nations Agenda 2030, which is actually at the heart of our talks. This is what we really explain how all this works. And it was interesting, actually, on Saturday when I was doing my talk, I got to the point where I was explaining the climate change fraud, and a picture of David Attenborough, as I call him, David Attenborough, appeared in my slideshow. And someone at the back said, "Oh, that's a step too far." And of course, many illusions were shattered from then on. Only two people walked out, and the rest of them stayed. And someone said to me afterwards that I think you may have ruined their weekend. But it's best to know than not to know, really, isn't it? In actual fact, I think it's empowering. But is it diverse and vibrant? Well, we're going to find out. So I'm going to thank Per in Sweden for sending in this article. This is by John W. Whitehead. And this is from the Rutherford Institute, which linked to what President Trump had to say after recent Parkland shooting in America, these shootings. And it was quite an interesting article, but it led me on to what Trump had actually said after these shootings, which is pretty chilling. This is where the deep state and the real government write the script, of course. Let's see what Trump actually said, in case there's anyone out there who hasn't heard it, and I hadn't actually read through this before. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike. Oh, is this the precautionary principle or something worse? This is the already predicted outcome of more and more draconian state power, as if there wasn't enough already. Now it carries on. As an example, the monster in the Parkland High School in Florida had many red flags against him, and yet nobody took decisive action. Nobody did anything. Why not? Okay, maybe because the red flags were put there, and maybe because many people post all sorts of things on Facebook, and even though they shut down everything outside the corridor of the accepted opinion already, the totalitarian global plan needs to completely disarm everyone, literally, and of course metaphorically. The whole population, that is. It's still a relatively difficult thing to do that in the United States, even after all of these shootings. So yes, we must make sure the white supremacists, the people who think that the Constitution still matters, we must make them the target while empowering the created divide and rule groups to make sure that identitarians are the only ones who have a voice and the only ones who are seen in the media. You know, tokenism. Those people who are chosen to be on the television screen. Let's see what else he said. Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. Now, actually, I agree with this. This is a good point, and mixed with the use of skunk, these computer games are a major cause of mental illness in my opinion, and basically cause complete detachment from reality. Well, I do know about this. I used to have one of these middle-aged gamers living upstairs from me, and the tantrums were actually psychotic, and the mentality was that definitely of a hyperactive 5-year-old child with a very serious anger issue. Maybe this was an isolated case, but I don't think so. And this fella was actually quite sane before he started doing this, or he appeared quite sane, but soon after the video gaming kicked in and became an obsession, then things started to change. So yeah, it says it's too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. Well, yes, it is. That's basically all TV, films and all forms of media. It carries on. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately. Well, great. Does that mean Hollywood's going? It's going to go bust? It's going to disappear? It is, isn't it? Probably not. It carries on. Cultural change is hard, but each of us can choose to build a culture that celebrates the inherent worth and dignity of every human life. That's what we have to do, yes. But this has been a useful social engineering, or aka social exclusion principle, since the late 60s, hasn't it? We talked about all this. We talked about Dr. Richard Day giving that lecture at Mount Sinai Hospital, and it's called The New Barbarians. Or you can look on our channel, and it's called Social Engineers Then and Now. Really interesting stuff, because everything that this paediatrician who worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or as it was known then, Planned Parenthood, has happened. Everything that was stated in that off-the-cuff lecture to some students has happened. And those students were told that, well, this is going to happen and nothing can stop us now. All he wanted to see, this Dr. Day, was the reactions of these students. However, let's carry on with this. Third, this is Trump's speech, remember, after the Parkland shooting. Third, we must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure these people not only get treatment, but, when necessary, involuntary confinement. Did you hear that? This is like the old Soviet Union, but of course that is the model for the new totalitarianism, but it's slightly updated. We call it communitarianism now, but it's totalitarianism really. Now here we have the Orwellian Brave New World, which will label all those who question any form of assumed authority as mentally ill. This is already being implemented, and it has been implemented against people. Even people who I know through this show have suffered at the hands of authorities who tried to have them sectioned when they brought up something which may be uncomfortable. So, very, very dangerous for Trump to be saying this. And of course, people are going to be really shocked because a lot of people thought Trump was some kind of libertarian. Well, it appears that he isn't. So, yeah, fourth, let's see what he has to say. We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That is why I have called for red flag laws, said Trump, also known as extreme risk protection orders. This is getting rather sinister, isn't it? So, the defender of the Constitution has now parted company with it forever. Where have we heard this before? Obama did the same thing, didn't he? He actually parted company with the Constitution, as did Bush before him. The gun grab is finally here then. Donald cannot deviate from the narrative imposed on him from above. Let's see what else he says. Today, I am also directing the Department of Justice to propose legislation ensuring that those who commit hate crimes, here we go, the H word, hate crimes, and mass murders face the death penalty, and that this capital punishment be delivered quickly, decisively, and without years of needless delay. There's an urgency going on here. Hate crimes, that indefinable and wide-ranging attack on those who might not agree with or might even have real information that the government's favourite lobbyists and the military-industrial complex may not like. You know what I'm saying here? This opens the door to stitch up those who may have the ability to think. So, pretty shocking stuff from Trump there. And that's the start of the totalitarians. Yeah, we're going to be talking about totalitarianism again this week. Our last two shows really covered what this shadow government was all about. We've covered this a lot in the past, of course. We're talking about a super agency under the United Nations. And I'm going to give you a bit of history on that tonight, because I've started to put this into my talk, as it's very important to know where it all came from. Now, we have covered that Maurice Strong went to the United Nations in the early 90s. And of course, he was the Secretary General at the time of the Rio Earth Summit in 92. So check out our previous shows for that. Really interesting stuff, and how Maurice Strong actually mentored all of this New Age strategy, giving these cults seats at the United Nations from his Baca Ranch, which is a 200,000 acre ranch. Just take a look at the history of Maurice Strong. We haven't got time to go into him again tonight, but we have covered him before. And of course, people say, oh, you're fueled by the fossil fuel industry because you deny global warming. Well, newsflash, news just in for the past 25 years, that the oil industry actually funds the global warming industry. It's the oil industry. Maurice Strong was a billionaire who made his money in the oil industry. So we're not going to talk about Jeffrey Epstein, which will now be pushed into the alternative media circus, but we're not going to do it, not in our name. This actually is from Per in Sweden. He just sent me this, quite amusing. He said, you can't make this up. I can't wait for the funeral where they bury this Epstein effigy, whilst the real Epstein is rubbing his hands in, well, let's guess any answers to where Jeffrey Epstein really is. Answers on a postcard, please. Conspiracy theory. It's remarkable how they already got the entire alternative media to dance to their tune in agreeing that he's dead. Interesting point, that, eh? And also that his body has been claimed by someone. Well, it just says someone. I know, you're going to say, you conspiracy theorists, I suppose you think the moon landings didn't happen. I suppose you think 9/11 was an inside job. I suppose you think Elvis's brain is on the moon. But he must be dead. Wait a minute, there was a picture of someone who looked a bit like him, wasn't there? Well, okay. Do you get the point? These are the sort of stories that gather momentum, you see, and there will be much speculation and false narratives released by the intelligence community that will keep it going. It'll keep going off at tangents for years with the help of the alternative media, which will actually bolster up the cover story. In reality, the creators of conspiracy theories are actually in the alternative media as well as in the deep state. So not just the intelligence services, sometimes the alternative media do the job of the intelligence services, don't they? We have reported on this before as well. Just like they did and are still doing with the more, well, let's say the whole elite network, which will include the usual suspects. Yes, we do cover this stuff quite a lot, but speculation will get you nowhere. Let's have a look at this next news item. Trump imposes total economic embargo on Venezuela. Now, this is from Zero Hedge. Late Monday, President Trump signed an executive order imposing a full economic embargo against Venezuela. After a week, the White House recently has been signalling it could seek to quarantine and fully blockade the Maduro regime if the president doesn't immediately hand over power of his own accord. Though it falls short of an outright trade embargo, it does dramatically escalate US efforts to force a Maduro exit in favour of US-backed opposition leader and self-proclaimed interim president Juan Guaido. Well, Peirce says that Trump and America first means they're global business partners too. Now, this is a very good point, and one that we could expand on. He says we're dealing with the man of lawlessness here, that's Trump, and he will cause astounding devastation across the globe that will also mark the final psychotic outburst of Uncle Sam, the self-appointed global sheriff. After that, the American beast is done for, says Peirce in Sweden, as its global business and operations partner Israel. That of course means Britain too, I've added that, because we're all part of the same unique partnership and we dance to the same tune through our mutual partnerships with the US and of course Israel. So now on to the bigger picture. Yes, let's really get into it. In looking at the origins of this Global Action Plan, or the UN Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, it's useful to look back at its history, and we have been doing that quite a lot lately. We've covered how the whole environmental movement was steered by big oil and billionaire Maurice Strong and given a platform by the UN, who adopted the globalist policies of sustainable development under the banner of saving the planet through fake science or global warming. In this show, we'll be talking about a document which laid out how a global control system would be implemented through a super agency, the United Nations, and how this would impact on all policy locally around the world and in every country. And as the UN says, nobody will be left behind. But where did this all start? It started in 1983 and then really got going in 1987 when a document called Our Common Future was produced. Now this was authored amongst a few other people by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway and also a member of the World Communist Party. Now this is really interesting. I'm just going to give you some quotes, and this might explain why we now have global governance under the UN. It says, and this is from Our Common Future, which came out in 1987, which is the blueprint for the global totalitarianism of United Nations Agenda 21. Governments must now make the key national economic and sectoral agencies directly responsible and accountable for ensuring that their policies, programs and budgets support developments that is economically and ecologically sustainable. Okay, so far so good. Let's get on to the next bit. This is where it starts getting a bit interesting. The UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, should be strengthened as the principal source on environmental data, assessment and reporting, and principal advocate and agent for change and international cooperation on critical environmental and national resource protection issues. UNEP's Earthwatch programme should be the centre of leadership to the UN system on risk assessment. A new international programme for cooperation among largely non-governmental organisations, scientific bodies and industry groups should therefore be established for this purpose. Now, this is where the IPCC comes in. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is this agency, which is under the UN, which they created. So that's a really interesting part of what Agenda 21 is all about. Now get this bit. The World Bank is presently reorientating its programs towards greater environmental concerns. This should be accompanied by a fundamental commitment to sustainable development by the bank. Of course, this was in 1987. It is also essential that the regional development banks and the IMF incorporate similar objectives in their policies and programs. Now, you see, the thing is, with all this going on, you don't need an environmental bank. The World Bank and all other banks become environmental banks. Isn't that interesting? The changes in human attitudes that we call for, remember this is the UN, the changes in human attitudes that we call for depend on a vast campaign of education, debate and public participation, meaning indoctrination at every level of society. From 8 to 80, people will be mentored into this programme. That's why we can talk about change agents a lot. And it says also, we cannot discuss environment or development without discussing political development. There must be more redistribution of power, said Aristides Katopo, who was the publisher of the WCED public hearing document in Jakarta, 26th of March, and that was 1985. So, it says here, how are individuals in the real world to be persuaded or made to act in the common interest? Isn't this fascinating? The common good, social equity, social justice. Fascinating. The world must design strategies that will allow nations to move from present destructive processes of growth onto sustainable development paths. This will require policy changes in all countries. This will require policy changes in all countries. Absolutely fascinating to read this document. Basically, it talks about reorientating technology and managing risk, which is, of course, smart cities and surveillance, ensuring a sustainable level of population, which means population reduction, the global billion, but 3 billion will do for now, merging environment and economies in decision-making, which means a land grab. Look at the Wilderness Conference. We were talking about that in the last show. Wilderness 11 started in 1974, these wilderness conferences, and they've been having them ever since. And they are talking about land grabbing 50% of the planet. And remember, they're going to privatize the seas as well. So that's all happening next year, folks. So that's a little bit about the background of the global totalitarianism. Well, pretty chilling stuff, eh? Along with what President Trump has been saying recently. So there's also a YouTube video you should watch, which gets considerably less views than our shows, and it's called Enablers for Achieving Agenda 2030. And this was from the World Government Summit earlier this year, and it's a global platform which is dedicated to shaping the future of governments worldwide. Did you get that? Shaping the future of governments worldwide. I thought we voted for these people. Well, apparently not. Each year, the summit sets the agenda for the next generation of governments, focusing on how they can harness innovation and technology to solve universal challenges facing humanity. Hey, that's good of them, isn't it? The annual gathering of the World Government Summit held in February 2019 in Dubai. Did you hear about this, folks? The Global Governance Summit, World Government Summit. You didn't hear about it? Oh, that's funny, isn't it? Well, it's only got about 800 views on YouTube as well. It's pretty shocking, really, isn't it? Yes, it was held in February 2019 in Dubai, hosts over 4,000 participants, so 4,000 useful idiots attended, and it invites world leaders, international organisations, representatives, thinkers at a UN conference, and experts from over 150 countries. Well, it is in fact a policy and planning conference for global totalitarian governance under the UN Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. Now, quotes from participating government delegates. Let's have a listen to it. Now, I've painstakingly gone through this video, which features the enablers of Agenda 2030, and I'm going to give you some quotes. Now, those who invest in the infrastructure and participate in the governance of their countries under the Global Action Plan. That's who we're going to be talking about. First of all, let's hear from Richard Razi, Deputy Prime Minister for Investment and Information from Slovakia. Let's hear what he said on participation, the participation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a control system of everything and everyone on the planet, if you actually read them. The SDGs are at the heart of all policy, national and local. They are foreign policies and at the core of strategic political framework. So basically what he's saying, it's global and local. It's national and international. He carries on. There must be partnerships among various stakeholders in every country. The state, academia, it's very important to get the academics on board because they will push it mercilessly because they do what they are told, and it's very difficult of them to think outside the box. Well, it's impossible for them to think outside of a box unless they leave academia, because otherwise they are pilloried and they lose their jobs. That's why you get these elderly academics finally saying, yes, it was all lies, folks. The UNIPCC, I did contribute to their papers, but now I'm saying it was all rubbish. Let's see what he said about polity integration. Sustainable development must be at the heart of all policies, national, regional, local, and also foreign policies. This agenda is at the core of strategic and political framework. So in other words, this is not just something that's non-binding. It is part of everything. It said it's not possible to reach our goals without the participation of all groups of people. Remember, no one will be left behind, folks. We must plan and invest for something which is beyond the political cycle. Did you hear that? We must plan and invest for something which is beyond the political cycle. In other words, it doesn't matter who's in power. This is going to roll on relentlessly. So forget right, left and centre. This is a steamroller coming down the middle. It says long-term strategies up to 2030. With a priority national investment plan will be carried out. This will be the main tool to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The facilitator of the conference, right, I've copied all this out, states, if we reach all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we will reach well-being. Well, no, we'll reach global totalitarianism, the title of this show. Let's hear from Maria del Pilar. She's the Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy from Costa Rica. She says redistribution of wealth and sustainable development is part of the DNA of our republic. Interesting, eh? Implemented through strong institutions. Yes, we know what those are. NGOs, all the rest of it, even government organisations, but mainly NGOs. Sound governance, tailor-made policies and evidence-based. It has to be evidence-based, does it? Oh, well, that ain't going to work then, is it? She says, we call this a bridge to human development. We go house to house, she says here. This is in Costa Rica. They go house to house, giving people a complete offer of social aid and making business sustainable. Interestingly, there is a smart city in Kazakhstan called Astana, and they are enforcing paperless transactions in all business deals. In all business transactions, you are not allowed now to use cash. That's what smart cities are for, folks, to take away all choice. So, it says this will go through fiscal reform and, of course, the old chestnut, redistribution of wealth, poverty for all, social justice, social equity. Now let's hear now from Jack Dangermond. He was the CEO of Environmental Systems Research Institute, which is basically the surveillance and monitoring aspect of Agenda 21. That's what this fella's there for. He said, we need a federated information system for the Sustainable Development Goals, national portals sharing data into a global system. And he talked about how they were achieving this and said it wasn't really at its peak at the moment, but they were working towards it. In other words, forget Google. This is going to be everything. And you thought Google was everything. Well, they're working towards the UN being at the top of it all. He just said 19 countries are already sharing local and national data into the UN portal, and it's called the Master Global System. The Master Global System. You're part of it, folks. Do you want to leave yet? Each of the national hubs are owned by the country and share data on a voluntary basis. That's good of them, isn't it? Open data is not an event, he says. It's a process. Open data is a process, an ongoing process. Growing spatially through maps and statistics, having a standard one world view that is based on authoritative sources. That's Jack Dangermond there. And he was the CEO and still is of Environmental Systems Research Institute, working for the UN there. Now, the facilitator at this point in the conference says local policies are a challenge to implementing the policies of the UN Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. How can we mobilise civil society? Now, let's hear from Enrico Giovanni, University of Rome, president of ISTAT, the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development. And this Enrico Giovanni says, I fell in love with the SDGs even before they were adopted. This man has useful idiot written all over him. 220 organisations, trade unions, business associations and universities are participating. Well, of course, universities are the breeding ground for the change agents and the lobbyists. Online courses on the SDGs have been taken by 33,000 teachers. They always have to get 33 in there, don't they? 11 being the kind of gateway number in Freemasonic Kabbalism, 22 being the work in action, and 33 being the completion of the work, of course. If you believe in that sort of thing, well, a lot of these people do, because a lot of them are Freemasons. We have developed a general equilibrium model of the entire world. Isn't that good of him? He's developed a general equilibrium model of the entire world so we can simulate alternative policies for sustainable development work through advocacy and policy advice. Yes, there you go. There's your lobbyists. Sustainable development will become part of the Italian constitution. Did you hear that? So the Italian constitution will have the UN Global Action Totalitarian Goals written into it. We will call upon citizens to sign a petition to implement this change. Oh, is this a bit like Extinction Rebellion, forcing governments to do what governments have been forced to do by the UN? I think so. I think it could be. Every year we have 700 events in Italy over 17 days, 300 through universities by students for young people. For young people. So you've got students now mentoring school children and school children lecturing adults that they should not be driven to school. Yeah, this is all going on, folks. It's happening in this country at the Extinction Rebellion child indoctrination program in South London. I've just seen a video of it, pretty shocking. Of course, the facilitators that they use are incredibly ineffectual and boring, and the children who were there were probably extremely dull, but they're the sort they want, aren't they? They? What do you mean, they? Like in They Live, the John Carpenter movie, where we sleep and they live. Now this Giovanni says, the only weakness we are seeing is in our own government. Again, you see, they're talking about going beyond national governance. The facilitator then says, who monitors the governments worldwide in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals? So who monitors them? Now, Maria del Pilar from Costa Rica says, we are mentoring women into tailor-made roles in the SDGs. Useful idiots. Empowering women to be slaves to the UN. How ironic is that? Women could lead the decarbonisation plan. What, they're going to kill all the women off? And also the fourth industrial revolution. These people have been so brainwashed, it oozes from every pore, but there's not much of it. We like to see women in power everywhere, she smirks, looking at the other fellas on the panel there. And this is it, you see. This is the divide and rule strategy. By empowering women, you're actually starting to cause a divide and rule among the sexes, you see, and that's the whole point, rather than sort of involve everybody, like both sexes, or the 38 genders, or whatever they are. Then you are actually dividing them against each other, creating resentment. Of course, the more divide and rule, the more power the elite structure has. So the facilitator then chips in. What are the challenges? Enrico Giovanni says, the agenda is very complex. We are seeing the renaming of government bodies, such as the French and Spanish, have now formed the Ministry for Ecological Transition. It's getting rather Orwellian, isn't it? Eh? This is a great way of thinking, he says. Well, it's a great way of thinking for you, yeah. Now, the director of UNESCO then pipes up and says, the Paris Climate Accord and SDGs must be integrated into one agenda. Now, Maria del Pilar from Costa Rica says, the decarbonisation of the economy plan and Agenda 2030 are interconnected. Of course they are, because it's a control and management system with population reduction thrown in. She says climate change is only seen as one part of the economy. Oh, first true word said there. So climate change is only seen as one part of the economy. Well, there's plenty of people making money out of it. Enrico Giovanni then says, instead of scanning the passes of those who attend the conference, what we should do is ask them, what is goal 13 of the SDGs? And if you do not answer fully, you do not get in. This is a joke, he says, but not really. Can you imagine what this man is actually thinking? This is incredible, isn't it? Now, if you look at 13 of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that's all about the implementation of the carbon tax and basically taking everyone's money away. Make SDGs the framework for all policies, says Enrico. No other frameworks should be used. Can you hear that? These people are making decisions on your behalf, folks. It's incredible, isn't it? Mainstream sustainable development, what does it mean? This is great. You're going to love this one. So, let me just read that again. Mainstream sustainable development. Enrico, what does it mean? He answers, everything and nothing. Now that is incredibly important because this sustainable development can mean anything that they want it to mean. So it means everything and nothing. That's perfect, isn't it? That's perfect for totalitarianism. Let's look at one of the authors now of the recent IPCC report on climate change policy and land use. Now his name's Pete Smith, because I think it's important that we introduce some of these people, give them a public face. And Pete is Professor of Soils and Global Change. Soils and global change. What a strange mixture. The soil's been here a long time, hasn't it? But global change is in the present and being implemented. So he's going to implement global change while talking about soil. And he's from the University of Aberdeen. Now, remember, these people aren't climate scientists, folks. Let's see what Pete does. He says, I'm a systems modeller. He's a systems modeller. So he does it all on a computer, working in global food systems, bioenergy, climate change impacts. Remember, not causes of climate change impacts and mitigation. This is where the money is, folks. They train people into mitigation and adaptation. This is the important bit. SDG 13. Check out all 17 of them. But what you're talking about here is just a management concept for the world. So he says, I led the agriculture and land use chapters for the IPCC mitigation volume for the last 2 assessment reports. I am and was a research fellow of the Royal Society from 2008 till 2013. Now, what a surprise, because the Royal Society is right behind this. Of course it would be, really, wouldn't it, when you think about it? He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he's currently a science director at Climate Exchange. Climate Exchange. He's up to his neck in it, this fella. Scotland's Climate Change Centre of Expertise, he's part of that. He's a Director of Food Systems of the Scottish Food Security Alliance and Crops, and theme leader. What's a theme leader? I've heard of a team leader, but he's a theme leader of cross-university theme on environment and food security. God, this fella is completely and utterly up to his neck in the Sustainable Development Goals, the taxation, restriction of land use, and control of everything on the planet. I wish some of his students would approach him and talk about this. That's Pete Smith there from University of Aberdeen. He says in his day job, he's a scientist, studying things such as how agriculture contributes to climate change. Okay, so he's a bit compartmentalised, is Pete, isn't he? He's not really getting the bigger picture, is he? He's not joining all the dots here. So he's studying things such as how agriculture contributes to climate change and what we can do about it. Again, mitigation. Mitigation, the 3 M's. Recently, though, he says, I found myself in Geneva to take part in my 4th adoption plenary for a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report in question was the recent special report on climate change and land, and I was one of the 15 convening lead authors, responsible, along with 2 others, for a 300-page chapter. A 300-page chapter? Not a book, folks, a chapter, on links between desertification, land degradation, food security and climate change. The adoption plenary is the process by which the 199 governments, 95 governments who are part of the IPCC reach, wait for it, our favourite word, the C word, consensus on the wording of a much shorter 40 or so page summary for policymakers. Now, these are the ones I've read, the summary for policymakers of an entire IPCC report and thereby adopt its findings. The process of approval is gruelling, says Pete. It's gruelling for all concerned. It's allocated 5 days with an additional reserve day allocated, which is often used. Now, during this period, every word of the policymaker's summary has to be agreed and approved, line by line, with delegates from all governments in the room. Incredible, this, isn't it? As an author, he says, I had to respond to comments from the governments and, for example, where language was unclear, suggest another form of words that was consistent with the findings of the underlying report, since the whole process of how IPCC reports are approved will be a mystery to most, indeed it is, to 99.99% of the population. I want to look at how this adoption process works and why we need to have them. So, the people on the IPCC making the decisions are already mentored into the programme of adaptation to climate change. This is the most important thing. The person who wrote this is not a climate scientist and is mentored into an already existing programme where his expertise is steered into the mitigation agenda. Now, that's my addition to that, and I think it's very important. Now, let's see what the UN say about their system. The United Nations system plays a critical role in supporting member states' implementation of intergovernmentally agreed sustainable development objectives. You see, this is the umbrella for it all. This is where it all filters down. System-wide coherence at global, regional, sub-regional and country levels is crucial for the UN system to deliver on its mandate effectively. Well, of course it is. Nobody will be left behind. A broad-based interagency coordination mechanism in this regard is the Executive Committee of Economic and Social Affairs Plus. Have you ever heard of this, folks? The Executive Committee of Economic and Social Affairs Plus, which brings together 50 plus UN entities. Remember, these NGOs, these entities, including funds and programmes, regional commissions, convention secretariats, specialised agencies, international financial institutions, the World Trade Organization and the IOM, as well as UN research institutes. Keep it in-house, folks, keep it in-house. It is convened and supported by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Wow, the United Nations System Chief Executive Board and the United Nations Sustainable Development Group continue to be instrumental in coordinating system-wide follow-up activities in their respective areas. They've got it all covered, haven't they, folks, really? Joint follow-up action by the United Nations system on specific thematic issues is also conducted through collaborative mechanisms such as the UN Water, UN Oceans, UN Energy and high-level task force on global food and nutrition security. Now, if this doesn't start making you feel a little bit strange, then you haven't been listening. I think I should actually just read that one out again. The joint follow-up action by the United Nations system on specific thematic issues is also conducted through collaborative mechanisms such as UN Water, UN Oceans, UN Energy, and the high-level task force on global food and, wait for it, nutrition security. They're controlling everything here. And this is why they're talking about the privatisation of all land, which is basically what it is, and of course the oceans. Okay, now let's get on to another story which ties into all this. The average US farm is $1,300,000 in debt. And now the worst farming crisis in modern history is upon us. Now this is by Michael Snyder. He says, we haven't seen anything like this since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, bearing in mind that food security is the control of all food on the planet by the UN, Monsanto, and of course its agents like Bayer, just get this. We haven't seen anything like this since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Leading up to this year, farm incomes have been trending lower for most of the past decade, and meanwhile, farm debt levels have been absolutely exploding. Now, this is in America. So US farmers were desperate for a really good year, but instead, 2019 has been a total disaster. Now, remember, we've talked about going into a solar minimum, so there are going to be crop failures. Now, this is absolutely fascinating, and it says here, if the horrific weather and endless flooding wasn't enough, about a week ago the Chinese government announced that they would be ending all purchases of US agricultural products. And that was a devastating blow for farmers all over the nation. Right now, the Chinese are spending enormous amounts of money to build a transportation infrastructure to ship soybeans grown in what used to be rainforests in Brazil. They aren't going to abandon all that just because Trump suddenly changes his mind. Now, this is a comment again from Per, who sent me some great stuff this week. The sadistic Trump regime has not only crapped all over its own voter base, but it has also permanently gutted the heartland in which must be seen as the biggest act of vandalism in the modern era. Now, if you thought Obama was bad, look what's happening under Trump. But of course, he's really got nothing to do with it. All these strings are being pulled by what they call the deep state and, of course, global governance. It's the UN Agenda 2030 on steroids, said Per. Well, he's absolutely right there, to get everybody off the land and into big cities where they can chip them and monitor them like cattle. Now, that's from Per in Sweden. Now, obviously that concurs with what we say, and it concurs with the conclusions that all of the researchers that we are partnered with are also saying. So it's really fascinating, this, and I think the time, folks, might be coming that we need to organise and get off grid a bit more and actually stop using Facebook and social media and actually start taking this seriously. Now, I've got quite a lot to get through this week. We've got some great stories coming in, so I'm going to sign off in a minute and I'm going to get into some more individual kind of news and some historical narratives this week. I've got loads and loads of information that's been building up. So do remember to go to the website, check out the shows that we're doing. And if you would like to host a bigger picture, which features myself, Piers Corbyn and Sandy Adams at a venue near you and to people who you know, do get in touch through the website. Now, that's it. I'm going to sign off tonight. I've just given you quite a lot of heavy information there. We've got some more entertaining things coming up in the next few weeks, and we're recording some things which will hopefully make you chuckle a bit too. So that's it for tonight from Windows on the World, and we'll see you again on Sunday. And do keep checking the website and get in touch with any stories that you may have, because the information that's coming in from you, the listener, is absolutely paramount. It's the most important thing for us, and thanks for all of the information that you send in. And until Sunday, that's it from Windows on the World. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net.